The static hum of the observatory was a familiar lullaby, one I'd once found soothing. Now, it just sounded like the dying breath of a universe I no longer believed in. Another night, another sweep of the void. My fingers traced the cool, worn metal of the console, the same console I'd once touched with a feverish excitement, a desperate hope. Now it was just a tool, a means to an end, and the end felt increasingly hollow. I used to lie awake, staring at the impassably distant pinpricks of light, my mind ablaze with possibilities, the sheer, boundless wonder of it all. Now it was just data. Numbers on a screen, patterns to be catalogued, anomalies to be filed away and forgotten. The universe, I'd learned, was far less interested in inspiring awe than it was in being. Indifferent. Utterly, monumentally indifferent. My gaze drifted to the window, to the sliver of moon hanging like a chipped fingernail in the ink-black sky. Below, the lights of the town twinkled, a distant constellation of human concerns, so small, so insignificant against the vast, silent canvas. I remembered a time when those lights had meant home, meant warmth, meant a life I was eager to build. Now they just felt like a reminder of how far I'd drifted, not in miles, but in spirit. Dean, that's me. Now, it felt like a label attached to a worn-out machine, performing its programmed functions with a weariness that seeped into my bones. The grant money was running out. The university was hinting at realignments. The cosmic ballet, as I'd once so romantically called it, was over. I was just cleaning up the stage. I stretched, my joints popping in the stillness. The air in the observatory was always cool, carrying the faint, metallic tang of machinery and the dry scent of dust. It was a scent that had once smelled of discovery, now it just smelled of stagnation. I ran a hand over my stubbled chin. Sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, not when there was still so much. Nothing to observe. My eyes scanned the readouts, a familiar, monotonous dance of spectral lines and flux densities. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual cosmic background radiation, the predictable pulse of distant galaxies. I was about to log off, to retreat to my cramped apartment and the lukewarm comfort of instant noodles, when a flicker caught my attention. It was subtle. A deviation so minor, so fleeting, that for a moment I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. A brief, almost imperceptible spike in the signal strength from sector Gamma-7. Gamma-7. A region of space notoriously devoid of anything interesting. Empty. A cosmic black hole of data, if I will. I zoomed in, my fingers moving with a newfound, albeit hesitant, agility. The spike reappeared, stronger this time, followed by a series of rapid, irregular pulses. Not the steady rhythm of a pulsar, nor the chaotic burst of a supernova. This was different. It was too ordered to be random, yet too erratic to be natural. My breath hitched. The pulses weren't just signals, they were structured. Like a language I couldn't understand, but could intuitively sense was there. My heart, a muscle I'd long suspected of harboring a dormant capacity for excitement, began to thrum against my ribs. A faint, almost forgotten ember of curiosity flickered to life. I cross-referenced the data. Nothing. No known celestial phenomena matched this signature. No satellite interference. No terrestrial broadcast. It was coming from deep space, from the silent, empty heart of Gamma-7. This wasn't just an anomaly. It felt like a deliberate intrusion. I adjusted the gain, straining to pull more information from the ether. They seemed to be coalescing, forming a pattern that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. My hands trembled. The observatory was situated on a high, desolate plateau, miles from any significant human settlement. The only structures for miles were a few weather-beaten research outposts, and on a nearby ridge, the ancient stones. The stone circle, older than known civilization. I'd always dismissed it as folklore, a romantic embellishment of a geological curiosity. The pattern, it was like nothing I'd ever encountered. Yet as I tried to decipher its meaning, a primal sense of recognition stirred within me, a feeling that this wasn't just new, but impassably old. The pulses grew faster, more insistent. The air in the observatory seemed to thicken, growing heavy with an unspoken presence. I felt a growing pressure behind my eyes, a sense of being observed, not by a telescope, but by something far more profound. The indifference of the cosmos was suddenly replaced by something far more terrifying. Attention. What was this signal? And why was it coming from a place I'd always thought was utterly, irrevocably empty? Another night. My fingers traced the cool, worn metal of the console, the same console I'd once touched with reverence, now just an instrument of my slow surrender. The anomalous signal, though, that was the flicker of something else. A heresy in the symphony of cosmic white noise. I'd spent the last 3 days glued to the data stream, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a gnawing curiosity I couldn't shake. The signal wasn't just there, it was structured, not like anything natural. No pulsar's predictable beat, no quasar's chaotic flare. This was a deliberate sequence, buried deep within the background radiation, like a whisper in a hurricane. My colleagues, what few remained, had dismissed it. Instrument error, one had grumbled, his voice thick with disinterest. A phantom echo from a dying star. But I knew my equipment, I knew the stars, and this was neither. The raw audio was a nightmare. It wasn't sound as we understood it, not really. It was a pressure, a vibration that seemed to resonate not in my ears, but in my bones. When I amplified it, the computer struggled. The waveforms warped, contorting into impossible geometries, jagged peaks, and unfathomable troughs that defied mathematical description. It felt wrong, like looking at a reflection in water that showed a sky with too many moons. I reran the diagnostics for the 10th time, my hands shaking. The equipment was pristine. The sky, as far as my telescopes could discern, was empty. Sector 7G. Nothing. No stars, no nebulae, not even a stray asteroid, just the velvet blackness that had always been my canvas. But the signal persisted, a persistent itch beneath the skin of reality. It was late when the investigator arrived. I'd received a terse message about a routine security check after my unusual energy consumption had been flagged. I hadn't seen an investigator in years. They usually dealt with more terrestrial matters. The heavy door to the control room hissed open, and a figure stepped in, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting. "Dean." The voice was gravelly low. I turned from the humming console, my eyes gritty. The investigator was a broad-shouldered man, his face a roadmap of hard lines and shadows. He wore a nondescript uniform, practical and worn. He carried no visible weapons, but his presence filled the cramped space with a quiet, unsettling authority. "That's me," I replied, my voice raspy. "What can I do for you?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes, sharp and observant, swept across the banks of monitors, the tangle of cables, the charts pinned to the wall. They lingered on the screen displaying the anomalous signal's spectral analysis, the impassable waveforms. "Been getting some unusual readings from this facility," he stated, his gaze finally settling on me. "Lot of power being drawn. For what?" I hesitated. How could I explain it? How could I put into words the unsettling truth that was slowly, inexorably taking root in my mind? "Just research," I managed. "Working on something new." He took a step closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Empty. What are I looking at out there that requires this much energy?" I gestured vaguely at the monitor. "A signal, an anomaly." He scoffed, a low, humorless sound. "Signals, we get a lot of those. Interference. Satellites falling out of orbit. Old Soviet junk. This isn't like that," I insisted, my voice rising. "It's structured, deliberate, and it's coming from nowhere." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Nowhere. That's a bold claim, Dean." He moved towards the console, his movements slow, deliberate, older than anything we can comprehend. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the display. The hum of the machinery seemed to deepen, to take on a more resonant, guttural quality. A faint, metallic tang like old blood began to fill the air. I hadn't noticed it before. "Ancient, you say?" The investigator's voice was softer now, almost conversational, but the tension in the room had ratcheted up several notches. He reached out a gloved finger, tracing the edge of the screen, not quite touching the glass. "Funny, we've been getting similar anomalies, reported from other remote sites. Places with unusual geological formations, places that have been around a long, long time." He paused, and I found myself holding my breath. My gaze was locked on his face, searching for a hint of what he knew, what he suspected. Like that old stone circle, older than known civilization out on the moors, he continued, his voice a low rumble. Odd energy spikes there too, always have been, according to the old texts. Nobody ever paid it much mind. Until now, the air in the control room felt thick, heavy. The static from the speakers seemed to coalesce, to form a low, insistent thrum that vibrated through the floor, through my teeth. The patterns on the screen pulsed, mimicking that rhythm. What was he implying? What did he know about those places? The thrumming intensified, a physical pressure against my eardrums. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a sensation, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate from the very bones of the earth. My fingers, usually steady on the keyboard, trembled. The patterns on the monitor, once abstract data, now felt like a language I was desperately trying to parse, a script written in the blood of stars. I glanced at the grizzled technician, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond mere lack of sleep. His eyes, dark and deep, held a knowledge that made my own scientific training feel like a child's crayon drawing. "Those places," he'd said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "they leave scars on the sky, on us." What scars? What was he talking about? My mind, usually a sharp instrument of logic, felt dulled, obtuse. The signal, that impassable cascade of data, was still washing over us, a relentless tide. It was from a void, a true emptiness, yet it was undeniably there. I'd spent years staring into the black, searching for answers, for meaning, and now the black was staring back, its gaze unnervingly coherent. I pushed away from the console, the worn metal cool against my palms. The control room, usually my sanctuary, felt suffocating. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, seemed to coil around me. I needed to breathe to think, but thinking felt like a dangerous luxury. My gaze fell back to the monitor. The patterns shifted, a new sequence emerging. It was more complex, more layered than anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just random noise. There was intent, a structure. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. This was it. This was the key. I began to isolate specific frequencies, to filter out the background chatter, focusing on the core of the transmission. It was like peeling back layers of cosmic skin, each one revealing something more alien, more profound. He knew what this signal was, but his knowledge was a burden, a secret he carried like a shroud. My fingers flew across the keyboard, mapping vectors, calculating trajectories. The source wasn't a star, not a planet, not even a nebula. It was a location, a specific point in the vast, indifferent expanse, and it was old, unimaginably old. The data points, when I finally managed to align them, didn't just indicate age. They suggested a primacy. This wasn't a signal from somewhere. It was a signal of somewhere that had existed before the light of our sun had even begun its journey. The signal resolved into a series of geometric impossibilities, shapes that defied Euclidean space, patterns that twisted and folded in on themselves. It was a mathematical expression of something that shouldn't exist. I ran a diagnostic, my heart racing a frantic, irregular beat against my ribs. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The data was clean. The implications, however, were anything but, and with that coordinate came a resonance, a ghostly echo that seemed to reach back through time and space, not just to me, to something far older. "It's a marker," I murmured, the words catching in my throat. "It's a beacon." The technician nodded, his gaze fixed on the pulsating screen. "Not for us," he said, his voice barely audible. And then on a secondary monitor, a faint anomaly flickered. It wasn't part of the original transmission. It was a response. A single, impassably clear data packet, originating from an entirely different direction, yet mirroring the structure of the first. It was a reply. My breath hitched. The signal was not a broadcast. It was a conversation. And we had just stumbled upon a party we were never meant to overhear. The sheer antiquity of the originating signal was staggering, a cosmic echo from a time before time. Now, something else was responding, something closer, something that had also heard the call. The technician stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to a dusty cabinet and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. He opened it, his gnarled fingers tracing faded diagrams. "They say," he began, his voice a low rumble, "that the oldest things are the most patient. They wait, they watch. And sometimes he looked at me, his eyes reflecting the eerie glow of the monitors. They call out. He pointed to a crude drawing in the journal. A circle of standing stones, ancient and weathered. This is where the echoes are strongest, he said, where the veil is thinnest. A stone circle, older than known civilization. The words themselves felt imbued with a forgotten power. He didn't answer. He just gestured to the journal, then to the monitor, then to the door. The implication was clear. The answer, or at least a piece of it, lay not in the sterile confines of the control room, but out there, in the raw, untamed earth. It felt like a predator's keen. My hands clenched into fists. I was an astrophysicist. I dealt with facts, with observable phenomena. But the data on the screen, the technician's cryptic words, the impossible response, they pointed to something else entirely, something that defied all known laws. The thrumming from the speakers had ceased, replaced by an even more terrifying quiet. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible. What ancient forces had been awakened? And what, or who, was responding to that ancient call? The chill wasn't just in the air. It had seeped into my bones, a creeping frost that had nothing to do with the night. The wind, a whisper at first, now moaned through the colossal uprights of the stone circle, older than known civilization, carrying with it a scent I couldn't place. Damp earth, yes, but also something else, something acrid and metallic, like old blood. My flashlight beam, usually a steady companion, wavered, catching on the lichen that clung to the rough-hewn surfaces of the stones. They were immense, these monoliths, their shadows stretching like grasping hands across the dew-slicked grass. I'd spent weeks poring over astronomical charts, chasing a phantom signal, and now I stood in a place that felt older than the stars themselves, a place that hummed with a forgotten energy. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The signal. It had pulsed from this very vicinity, not from the sky, but from beneath. I dismissed it, of course. A geological anomaly, a quirk of the equipment. But the more I dug, the more the data pointed to something else. Something that resonated with frequencies that shouldn't exist, frequencies that spoke of an age before human understanding. And the signal, when it had last flared, had been accompanied by a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the local gravity readings. A tremor, a sigh from the deep. I ran a gloved hand over the nearest stone. The carvings etched into its surface were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not runes, not hieroglyphs. They were geometric, impossibly complex, spiraling inwards like a maddening fractal. As my fingers traced a particularly intricate curve, a low thrumming started, not in my ears, but in the soles of my boots, vibrating up through my legs. It was a sound I felt more than heard, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to originate from the very heart of the earth. This wasn't just a place of ancient stones, it was a nexus. The signal hadn't been from space. It had been a response. A call answered, but by whom or by what? The wind picked up, swirling dust and leaves around my ankles. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to clear the fog that was beginning to cloud my thoughts. This was something else entirely. A faint light bloomed in the center of the stone circle, not the steady beam of a lamp, but a pulsating luminescence, a sickly green that cast the ancient stones in an unholy glow. It flickered, then intensified, revealing something at the heart of the circle that hadn't been there moments before. Within the distortion, shapes seemed to form and dissolve, shifting with a speed that made my eyes ache. They were amorphous, yet possessed of a terrifying, alien geometry. I could feel a pressure building in my head, a dull ache that intensified with each pulse of the strange light. My mind, trained to seek logical explanations, screamed in protest. This defied physics. It defied everything I understood about the universe. Yet here it was. The signal had been a beacon, and something had answered. Something that didn't belong to my world. The acrid, metallic scent grew stronger, stinging my nostrils. I took a stumbling step back, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The thrumming beneath my feet intensified, a seismic tremor that shook the very stones around me. Dust rained down from the lintels, settling on my shoulders like a shroud. I could see it more clearly now, the core of the disturbance. It wasn't just light. It was substance, a shifting, viscous mass that pulsed with an internal rhythm, an obscene parody of life. Tendrils, impassably thin and sharp, snaked out from the central mass, probing the air, brushing against the ancient stones. Where they touched, the lichen hissed and withered, turning to ash. My breath hitched. This was not an anomaly. This was an intrusion. It was a language of pure sensation, of primal fear. My hands trembled, fumbling for the emergency beacon in my pack. But my fingers felt numb, clumsy. I had to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this place and never look back. But a morbid fascination, a scientist's insatiable curiosity, held me rooted. What was this thing? What was its purpose? And why had the signal, my signal, drawn it here? The pulsating light flared again, brighter this time, and the distortion expanded, reaching out like an eager, hungry mouth. It was moving, towards me. The thrumming intensified, no longer a vibration, but a deafening roar that filled my head. My vision swam. There was I seeing things. They were the stones themselves shifting, their ancient carvings writhing with a life of their own. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing in on my chest, making it hard to breathe. What was happening to the world? The wind. It was the wind, I told myself. Just the wind playing tricks in the hollows of the stone circle, older than known civilization. But my hands, gripping the cold, rough surface of one of the monoliths, were slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. The scent. It was still there, beneath the sharp tang of pine needles and the damp, mineral smell of the earth. Something else, something like ozone, but thicker, heavier, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach churn. I'd come here because the signal, the one that had started it all, had pulsed with a new intensity just before I left the observatory. And that intent, I was beginning to suspect, was not friendly. The sheer antiquity of this place, the raw, untamed energy that seemed to hum beneath the soil, felt connected. Like a receiver or a beacon. My flashlight beam, a nervous tremor, swept across the weathered stones. They stood like silent sentinels, their surfaces carved with symbols that defied any known script. I'd spent days poring over archaeological texts, ancient mythologies, anything that might offer a clue. Nothing. These carvings were older, stranger than anything humanity had ever conceived. Yet they felt familiar, resonating with a deep, primal part of my mind that I'd long since buried under equations and stellar cartography. I needed more information, more context. The entity that sent the signal, it wasn't just a phenomenon. It was something. And if it was capable of reaching across such unfathomable distances, it was capable of what? Influence, destruction. The possibilities were a black hole threatening to swallow my sanity. My gaze fell on a particular stone, larger than the rest, its surface a tapestry of swirling lines and geometric impossibilities. A faint luminescence seemed to emanate from its depths, a subtle internal glow that flickered like a dying ember. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cool, smooth contours. A jolt, not of electricity, but of something far more profound, shot up my arm. Things that moved with a logic alien to anything I understood. I snatched my hand back, gasping. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't just a signal, it was a communication. And this place, this ancient stone circle, was a part of it. But who built it, and for what purpose? I knew I couldn't stay here, not alone. I had to find someone. Someone who might understand, or at least someone who had also seen the impossible. The thought of another human being, another mind grappling with this cosmic horror, was a lifeline. But where? Who? The world I knew felt suddenly fragile, a thin veneer over something vast and terrible, watching us, and perhaps watching it. I needed to go back to the observatory, not to the pristine, sterile environment of my work, but to the hidden corners, the forgotten archives, the dusty tomes that might hold a sliver of truth. As I turned to leave, a faint, rhythmic pulsing emanated from the very ground beneath my feet. It wasn't the signal from space, but something closer, deeper, a slow, deliberate thrum, like a colossal heart beating in the earth. The air grew heavy, thick with that cloying, sweet scent. My breath hitched. The stones seemed to lean in, their silent vigil turning into something more menacing. What was awakening? The wind, the scent. It was stale like dust and something else, something metallic and acrid, clinging to the damp earth. The air vibrated, a low hum that seemed to originate not from the wind, but from within the stones themselves. It was a resonance that vibrated in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. I'd come here seeking answers, chasing a phantom signal that had drawn me from the sterile confines of my observatory to this desolate, windswept plateau, and it pointed here. The sky above was a bruised purple, the first stars beginning to prick through the deepening gloom. There was a wrongness to the light, a subtle shift in its quality, as if the very spectrum of existence had been bent. My gaze swept across the circle, then snapped back to the central stone, the largest and most imposing of the lot. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I was sure of it. My heart gave a lurch, a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. This was not a geological event. This was an opening. The hum intensified, a palpable pressure building in the air. My vision began to blur at the edges, the world taking on a shimmering, unstable quality. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the hallucination away, to anchor myself in reality. But reality itself felt like it was fraying. When I opened them again, the fissure on the central stone had widened. It scraped at the edges of my sanity, 1,000 tiny needles pricking at my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my boots crunching on the gravelly earth. My breath hitched in my throat. This was the source, the anomaly, not a signal, but a presence, something that had been here dormant for eons and was now stirring. My research, my equations, my entire life's work felt utterly inadequate. I had looked to the stars for understanding, for patterns, for the elegant mathematics of the universe. But the universe, it seemed, held horrors that defied any equation, any formula. This was not a discovery. It was an unveiling of something that should have remained hidden, buried beneath the weight of cosmic time. I could feel its pull, a subtle tug on my very being, an invitation to step into the absolute unknown. My mind, trained to observe, to analyze, to categorize, was failing. It couldn't process this. It refused to. My hands trembled as I reached for the small, rugged tablet I always carried, its screen displaying the last vestiges of data from the anomalous signal. The readings were spiking off the charts, a chaotic symphony of impossible energy. But the signal itself was changing. It was no longer a broadcast. It was a hunger, a yearning, and it was directed at me. It stretched towards me, slow and deliberate. It was not a physical touch, but something that resonated directly with my consciousness, probing, assessing. My training screamed at me to document, to record, to understand. But primal instinct, buried deep beneath layers of scientific detachment, screamed at me to run, to flee, but where? The plateau offered no sanctuary. The tendril was closer now, inches from my outstretched hand. I could see the carvings on the monoliths shifting, contorting, as if reacting to its presence. My lungs ached with the frigid intake. I could feel my own thoughts being pulled, unraveled like threads from a frayed tapestry. What was it? What did it want? And what would happen if it touched me? My fingers fumbled for the emergency beacon in my pocket, its small red light, a pathetic defiance against the encroaching cosmic nightmare. But even as my thumb hovered over the activation button, a profound weariness settled over me. If I called for help, who would believe me? And if they did, what could they possibly do against this? The tendril was almost upon me, a silent, predatory promise. I had to do something. Now, but what? The wind, the scent. It was still there, a metallic tang laced with something else, something that reminded me of ozone and damp earth. A wrongness. The signal. I'd done it, sent it. Had it worked? It was a heavy, expectant hush, as if the very air held its breath. My chest felt tight, constricted. The stars above, usually a comforting blanket of distant, predictable light, seemed to press down, their patterns subtly altered, sharper, more angular. I scanned the Inkai expanse, my gaze snagging on familiar constellations that now felt alien, their familiar shapes twisted into something else. I hugged myself, my teeth chattering. The stone circle, which had always felt ancient and grounded, now seemed to hum with a latent, terrifying energy. The monoliths, once silent sentinels, now felt like teeth in a colossal, unseen maw. I looked back at the crude transmitter I'd jury-rigged. Wires snaked across the damp ground, connecting salvaged components to the central obelisk. It looked pathetic, a child's toy against the immensity of what I had faced. Had I truly believed such a thing could stem the tide, a tide that had been flowing for millennia, perhaps longer? My eyes fell on the ground near the transmitter. A faint shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road, danced above the earth. It wasn't heat, though. It was a distortion, a ripple in reality itself. The scent of ozone intensified, prickling my nostrils. I took a step back, my boot crunching on loose gravel. What had I unleashed? Or worse, what had I failed to stop? It had promised oblivion, not as an end, but as a transformation, a dissolution into something vast and indifferent. And I, Dean, had tried to fight it with radio waves. I ran a hand through my hair, my fingers trembling. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, a scientific framework to contain the impossible. But the entity, if that's what it was, had defied all known physics, all rational thought. It was a truth that existed outside our universe, a truth that had brushed against our reality and left it scarred. It was a hole, not in the ground, but in existence. My vision blurred. The edges of my sight seemed to fray like old film. I staggered back, my legs suddenly weak. The stars above, they were definitely wrong. They were too bright, too sharp, and they pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence that was deeply unsettling. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting. A single, guttural sound escaped my lips, a choked gasp. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, cloying. I could feel a pressure building behind my eyes, a dull ache that intensified with each throb of the unseen hum. This wasn't just a physical place. It was a junction, a point where something had breached, and I had opened the door wider. It was growing, slowly but inexorably. I could feel a pull, a subtle tugging sensation, as if the air itself was trying to drag me towards it. My feet felt rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity warring with a primal urge to flee. What was that sound? My gaze was drawn back to the sky. A single star, brighter than all the others, flared for a moment, then winked out. Was this a consequence? A response? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the impossible sights, the impossible sounds. But they were already inside me, seared into my consciousness. The hum was louder. And the stars, they were still wrong. What had I done? Had I saved anything, or had I merely hastened the inevitable unraveling? The wind picked up, a mournful sigh that swept through the ancient stones, carrying with it the scent of something ancient and hungry. I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet, a low thrum that was slowly, imperceptibly growing stronger. Was this the end, or merely the beginning of the true horror? The wind, the scent. It was stale like dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. A faint metallic tang that tickled the back of my throat. The air itself felt heavy, pressing in, as if the very atmosphere had congealed. My breath hitched. The monolith beneath my fingers vibrated, a low thrumming that seeped into my bones. It wasn't the wind. It was coming. I pulled my hand away, the rough stone leaving a faint sting on my palm. My gaze swept across the circle. The stones, massive and weathered, stood like sentinels, each carved with symbols that writhed just at the edge of my vision, shifting and reforming like a trick of the light. I'd spent weeks trying to decipher them, convinced they held the key. Now I understood. They weren't a language, they were scars. A tremor ran through the ground, more pronounced this time. The scent intensified, the metallic tang now overlaid with something acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike, but wrong, inherently wrong. My eyes darted to the center of the circle. The earth there was disturbed, not by recent digging, but by something ancient, something that had pushed its way up from unimaginable depths. A faint luminescence began to bloom from the fractured soil, an unearthly blue that pulsed in time with the thrumming. This was it, the source. Not a transmission, not a message, but a doorway, or perhaps a wound. The anomaly wasn't out there in the silent reaches of space. It was here, buried, waiting. My research, my obsession, had been a foolish, arrogant attempt to understand the unknowable. I hadn't found a signal. I had disturbed a slumber. The air crackled with an unseen energy, making the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. I could feel it now, a pressure building behind my eyes, a disquieting sensation that my very thoughts were being observed, not by an intelligence I could grasp, but by something far more fundamental, a consciousness woven from existence itself, a thing that perceived me as little more than a fleeting anomaly in its own vast, alien landscape. A low hum filled the air, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. The symbols on the stones flared with the same unearthly blue light, their shifting forms now more pronounced, more terrifyingly alive. They weren't scars, they were bindings, and they were failing. My legs felt like lead. I wanted to run, to flee this place, to pretend I had never seen the signal, never felt the pull. But my feet were rooted, my gaze fixed on the growing light in the center of the circle. The truth, when it finally presented itself, was not a revelation, but a crushing weight. The universe was not empty, nor was it indifferent. It was teeming with horrors, ancient and vast, that existed on planes beyond my comprehension. My discovery hadn't been a triumph. It had been a trespass. The ground lurched. Dust and small stones skittered away from the pulsating light. The hum intensified, becoming a low roar that threatened to shatter the very air. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate, futile gesture. The light, the sound, the pressure, they were inside me now. I could feel the edges of my own reality fraying, the solid ground beneath my feet seeming to ripple. Was this how it ended? Not with a bang, but with a silent, agonizing unraveling. A single, coherent thought managed to pierce the cacophony. This is not a victory. This is an apology. I had stumbled upon something that should have remained buried, something that had been contained for reasons I could now dimly perceive a mercy, perhaps. And by seeking, by probing, I had weakened the seals. I opened my eyes. The light had reached its zenith, a blinding azure vortex that seemed to swallow the very sky. The metallic scent was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of ozone, but still with that undertone of wrongness. Drained. The vortex wavered, then slowly, agonizingly began to recede. The earth settled with a sigh. The luminescence faded, leaving only the fractured soil and the ancient, silent stones. The pressure in my head eased, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache. It was over, or at least this part of it was. The breach had been sealed. Or perhaps it had simply retreated, leaving me with a terrifying understanding. The cosmos was not a canvas of stars to be charted, but a prison for things that should never be disturbed. I had seen behind the curtain, glimpsed the true, horrifying architecture of reality, and I could never unsee it. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, but steady enough to grip the rough surface of a monolith. The scent was gone. The thrumming had ceased. The wind, for now, was just wind. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that the silence was a temporary reprieve. The entity was still there, waiting. What would happen when the bindings finally broke?